What have you two got going on?
There's a lot. Just had so many meetings and um have to go OTF tonight, my eighth one for the month, or else I'm not gonna. I have to get 8 in each month, and tonight's my last chance because I can't tomorrow because we have kickball. So
Wait, what? What's that?
Orange Theory
Oh,
Fitness. I have to go to the gym
oh.
tonight,
I'm like,
and
I
that's
don't know
always
what
like
I don't know what OTF is here.
I have to work myself up to it every. I still hate it so much. I mean, it's good compared to all other gyms I've done. I hate exercise. I just hate it.
I'm not a gym person.
No, I am not a gym person. But unfortunately, I was not a gym person for so long that I became not a healthy person. And yeah, I got tired of getting winded climbing the stairs. So
Understood. Yeah. I've been trying to do the bike, which I'm really good at streaks. Like sometimes I'll go almost 20 days in a row and then I'll hit like either physically or mentally. I'm like, I just can't do it anymore. And then it's like, once I lose the streak, I'm like, what's taking like 14 days off? It's
yeah,
nothing.
yep,
So,
yep. I get the same problem.
yeah.
Yeah. I did the
Oh,
group
got to
fitness
get on the mute
CrossFit
button.
thing for a few years, and it was good. But then with the kiddo, like it just got harder, and especially after Suzanne went back to work, to get up, get to the gym, get home so she could go. And so I got out of that routine. I'm back into the workout at home routine, which I've been in a pretty good routine for the last couple of months. It's been feeling good, but I'm really trying to get better at it. Not gonna lie, I've been eating my feelings the last couple of months, and I am in no ways ready for summer or just you know any kind of physical activity. So I'm trying to really get back in, just in shape, the shape I was
Right.
in,
Yeah.
prior to last year.
Yep.
I feel you. It's that time.
Mm-hmm.
It is
But
that.
I actually think that gives me a good segue for our topic today.
All
Oh, yeah.
right.
And that was not planned; it just happened.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So last week, Jason, you weren't able to join us. Jen and I kicked off a series, getting back into the nuts and bolts of analytics implementations and data collection strategy and architecture. It's something we haven't talked about in a while. So we kicked it off last week. This week, I want to dig in and talk about what do we see as the keys to a solid implementation. And I can see this going multiple ways. There are the things that you can consider tangible, like solid requirements documentation. We can get to that. Things that are broader, like buy-in at various points in the organization. But yeah, focusing on data collection architecture, analytics implementation. Um, like you need a solid implementation if you want to do well elsewhere. It seems quite obvious. So that's where I see the segue with the fitness thing. Talking about just having a good fitness routine to feel better at other aspects of life. Having a solid analytics implementation, a solid data collection architecture. We know the benefits there of having reliable data that they could be used in various ways and whatnot. So that's really where I saw the segue. So yeah, let's just go ahead and dig in. And what do we see as the keys to having a solid implementation? And by the way, is the Amazon guy there?
Yeah, Jen's gonna have to. The Amazon guy's here.
It's funny. I think my dog is hearing the barking through my headset and is looking up all freaked out. So you might hear her bark in response.
Oh, that's
Um,
funny.
well, in the in the invite for this, actually, you said, what are the keys to a solid implementation? Let's see. Implementation is often pitched as just do X, Y, Z, and you're all set. And that right there, you're all set, was really stood out to me because I think that's the perhaps one of the bigger problems that folks encounter out there in their implementations is thinking that you're ever all set and done. um, there will never be a time where you're implementation is done and you can wipe your hands of it and move on. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because your site's certainly not going to just be set and never change. And hopefully the questions you're asking about it aren't ever going to be set and never change. So to me, that's one of the biggest things, is just acknowledging that an implementation is going to be a constant maintenance, rather than just set it and forget it or anything like that. Which kind of leads me into the next thing I wanted to say is important for a healthy implementation. I'd say auditing your solution regularly. And most folks, when they hear audit, they think scanning the site, making sure that your data quality is correct, and observe point type of stuff. And that is valuable and important. But I'm actually talking about auditing your solution, like your solution design of, are we still using this variable? Are we putting a lot of effort into maintaining this variable that no one has reported on for months? Or just looking through and seeing, oh, hey, that variable hasn't been getting data for a really long time. So I think folks that can do that quarterly and just kind of go through their reports, and it's a manual process. There's the Adobe Health Dashboard, which helps if you can get it to work on your machine. But I've ended up just manually going through report by report, and have an extra column in my solution design variable map spreadsheets that says, this is the last time that we validated the health of this and that it's still in use. And if no one has used it or cared about it in a long time, we might not even necessarily retire it, but I am going to push to not put effort into maintaining it, because a lot of the time we see that a report isn't working and we throw resources at it, and then afterwards we're like, oh yeah, no one's going to use that report, or no one was using it. It's just we don't like having a broken thing, so we end up focusing on fixing a lot of smaller broken things rather than looking at the important things that we should be paying attention to.
It's a really good point. It's a good segue into one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot from a data perspective, in that I think there are two worlds that have to be addressed, and both of them have a implication on the underlying implementation. One, unfortunately, I think heavier than the other. So one is the real world. And the real world is, what are the few things that we need to truly understand, to understand our customers, to understand the health of our digital property. These things all usually don't get all the attention, but they're the things that make using analytics drive a business. And if you think about the companies that you've worked with over a decade plus of working with different brands, what percentage of them would you say was really using the bulk of the data they're collecting, versus so much data, implementations that are so broken that they aren't even really using it? And
That's
so
such a sad question.
it is, but
I hate thinking about the answer. It's so demoralizing.
it is demoralizing. And I think a big part of it is driven by world number two, which is the illusion of what you are doing. And we can't write it off, because it's clear that so many executives and even those working in analytics are being asked to address, either by themselves or someone else, the illusion of what we're doing. And that is that we always have to be in a state of doing something bigger and better than what, quote, we're currently doing. We definitely have to be doing something that everyone else is talking about. And that's why you get into these conversations about, well, yeah, we're looking about wiring our CDP into a lake house on the lake shore with the ocean mart. And we're going to get that done this year. I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, you guys can't even tell me how many people came to your site last week. What are you talking about? But they have to keep up the illusion that the data analytics portion of their business is getting more and more mature. And I think that that's the unfortunate part, is because of that need for always doing more overrides the need to do less but better. And so we instrument more, we integrate more, and it all sounds really great. And, it's like, yes, if all this can work, it really would be amazing. And then it doesn't. And then it degrades the implementation. You have all this data that isn't usable. And then you go and you say, okay, we want to ask just the very basic of questions. And people kind of shrug their shoulders like, yeah, we can't do that.
When I take that a step further, you say in your example, you guys can't even tell me how many visits you had last month. To me, it's maybe you do know how many visits you have that last month, but you're currently not using that knowledge in any great way. So yeah, I mean, maybe you could properly set up your bigger data management platforms and fancy integrations and all of that, and even get them working, for a time, because everything takes maintenance. But if you're currently not getting enough value out of the implementation you have, often the answer isn't throw more resources at more tools. It's figure out what's broken in your processes that's makes it so you're not getting value out of the tools you have. Because if you're not getting value out of your current analytics, you're probably not going to get value out of something bigger and complicated that takes a lot more effort to maintain.
Yeah, and I think that is the key word, maintain. Is that we haven't learned our lesson that when you buying something is one thing, but maintaining it is something else. You may be able to get the money together and get the financing to buy a 12,000 square foot house. But the next question is, can you maintain it? Like, not only can we keep it clean, but now we have to run like probably 2 or 3 separate air conditioners and this really complicated irrigation system outside. And it probably has 3 kitchens. Now we have 3 dishwashers so buying it is one thing. Maintaining it is something completely different. And I think our eyes get really big when we see the big fancy house that we want to buy. And we don't think about the actual costs and what it's going to take to maintain it. And so we say, yes, I want that. That's going to give us everything we want. We buy the house. And we're like, damn, this is a lot of work to keep this maintained. And so oftentimes we don't maintain it. And then when you don't maintain things, it quickly falls apart, especially in digital where things are moving so quickly and digital properties are changing. If you don't maintain an implementation, 3 to 6 months, it could be drastically deteriorated in just that little amount of time. So I think it is such an important conversation that isn't had. And again, one of the compounding problems is we have these incredibly small teams that we're asking to own these gigantic implementations, and we're asking them to add more and more, which means theoretically more and more maintenance, but the size of the team stays the same, and something has to give at some point.
Yeah, I love the maintenance thing. So I want to dig into that for a second, because Jason, you bring that up, and I can think of so many conversations I've had in the last 6 months, and even going back even further, and the lack of desire to want to maintain it. Because I mean, there's glory, on an implementer side to, oh, we deployed this new dimension, this new custom metric for this click on the website. But there's no glory in going through and saying, hey, we corrected 3 wrong things that we found, or there was a change on the website and nobody noticed this one metric went askew. We went in and fixed it.
Or there's no glory in just there being nothing to fix, right? Which is the ultimate state of we are being so proactive in our maintenance that we don't have to fix things. And for me, I quite enjoy maintenance. I have a hot tub, and I have this routine where every Saturday I do a maintenance, and then every 4th Saturday I do another maintenance. And from the outside, it's like, yeah, not a lot of is happening there. It doesn't look as flexing as much work as, oh, Jason drained the entire hot tub and scrubbed it down and got all the ickies out of it and refilled it and rebalanced the water. It's like, well, I didn't have to do that because I did these little things every Saturday, and it kind of went a long way, but it doesn't go noticed. And I think I may have shared, Jim, on a previous episode, my experience when I was working early in my career in IT. IT is such an organization that is ripe for being the heroes of fixing the things. And because of that, I think we were being told that, don't do maintenance, because when stuff breaks, we get to jump in and fix it and be the heroes. And so, that started happening more and more. And there was actually one case, and we talked about it in the case of firefighters setting fires.
Yeah.
There was one case where a guy on our team actually went in and broke something so he could then go in and fix it.
Gee,
So
that's
it
crazy.
it is crazy to think about, but it happens. So
Whereas to me, and maybe maybe I've just had too many recent experiences, so this is on my mind. So back to the example of the 12,000-foot house, that folks often get a lot of things set up, and it is important to maintain stuff, but it's important to maintain the stuff that's being used. I think I have a little bit of bitterness perhaps because so much of the time, a team, let's say they have someone who does regular QA, fantastic, except that person is separated from the person doing analysis. So QA person spots that 𝐓�R 75 isn't firing on this particular link, creates a JIRA ticket, gets added to the backlog, and we work on it. And it becomes a whole big thing, and maybe it's harder to fix than we thought it would be, and whatever. And so a whole lot of effort goes in on the developer and implementation side of things to get that 𝐓�R 75 fixed. And then you go back to the analysts and tell them it's fixed, and they say, "Oh yeah, no, we don't use that." um, that I think making sure that the data you are working on and maintaining, or perhaps including as part of the maintenance, is the use of the data, and making sure that um, you're not collecting things for the sake of collecting things and maintaining things for the sake of maintaining things.
So, how much do you think that is a byproduct of not aligning with what the stakeholders or consumers of the data feel is worthwhile, versus maybe it was worthwhile at some point in time,
Right,
but
yeah.
because of lack of maintenance or whatever, now the data is so messy that they don't want to look at it?
Probably a little of both. And I do suspect that most things that get implemented did at one time make sense, and somebody thought that they'd get value out of it. Um, and then maybe they get the data and they realize that maybe it's not as insightful as they wanted, or they leave the company and the next person doesn't know what to do with the data. Um, yeah, I certainly do think that that happens. I think some of it too is just it's hard to prioritize data.
Yeah.
It's we when I a long time ago, and I was working for McDonald's. Actually, they had a whole bunch of QA and auditing processes, and it was fabulous. We had this monstrous spreadsheet that could tell you every single touch point and the quality of the data there and all of that. It was great. But if we prioritized and said page views is very important. If page views is broken anywhere, that is something we have to prioritize and fix. And it gets so much more complicated if you go in there and say, okay, page views on confirmation page is important. Page views on this other page, okay, that one might not be working right now, but that's because nothing on the site links to it and it doesn't get any traffic and we don't need to bother fixing it, even though we said page views is important. It's that kind of thing of it's all so interconnected that getting, I think really the only answer is getting the analysis and insight and value gettingness more connected to the implementation so that prioritization can happen.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. So two follow-ups to that. One, I think that is such an important component that if companies aren't doing, they should drop everything they're doing right now and think about how they can make that work. And that we see analysis as separate from the data collection, and we see data collection separate from the analysis. And it's simply not. They're so tightly coupled together that for those two components to be broken apart is a recipe for disaster. And in our industry, we do typically break those up into separate roles. When you look at other components of analytics, whether it's data science or other business analytics, oftentimes those are very coupled together, and sometimes even the same person that is capturing the data and analyzing the data. But for the space that we work in, it's often very different roles, and not only very different roles, different people with completely different skill sets that often don't talk together. And in some companies, these are completely separate teams that roll up through completely separate leadership. And I think it just makes it incredibly difficult to have a strong implementation. And I think it makes it incredibly difficult to drive really meaningful insights from the data without those two pieces working tightly together. So if you have kind of the traditional, in our space, implementer, architect, analyst, reporter, fill in the blank, and they're not working together through the entire process, both implementation and analysis, that needs to be fixed. The second part of it is, as an implementer, an architect, someone in a more technical analytics role, do you feel like maybe there's a lack of pride in the work that we do, or do you think that there's been so much defeat in being put in no-win situations that we've kind of given up? Because to me, and I'll give you a really maybe an outlier of an example, but maybe I don't think it is. Was working with a company that had an incredibly heavy, large implementation. I spent many, many hours pulling apart one of their purchase flows. And I sat down with the key stakeholders and I said, I have some really bad news. The data that you've been reporting on, the decisions you've been making are just absolutely wrong. The implementation through this flow is absolutely broken. And they said, no, it's okay. And I said, what? Oh yeah, no, we don't use that data anyway. And as an implementer, like I would take that personally, that it's like, wait a minute, like this is my entire job. I'm putting this in place and you're just kind of brushing it off. We don't use that anyway. So again, my question, Jim and Jen, is how much of that is that maybe we're not taking the level of pride that we should have in our job, that it's not just collecting the data, it's actually unlocking what we're going to use that data for? Or have we been, again, put in these really difficult situations to succeed so often that we've just kind of given up caring as much as a protective measure? It's like, man, we've been beat up doing this so much, just we'll get the data in and we're going to call it a day.
I think that at least on the pride side of things, I think it comes back to that bifurcation of roles of I can be proud in the data that I set up, and then it's completely demoralizing to go to the analysts and have them be like, oh yeah, no, we're not using that. And it almost goes to the wrong extreme of, if you tell me that a data set is slightly broken and you need to answer a particular question, I love diving in and solving those problems. Just like I love when a data layer is broken and I get to go scrape stuff out of the DOM because it's a fun challenge. And at the end, I can be like, ha, I worked with what you gave me and I made it work and look at me. And like those are really validating and proud moments for me, but it's totally not the way you should do things. It should not be about me getting to show off my cleverness and me working with the limited, incorrect, broken set of stuff that we currently have. It should be fixing it so that it doesn't get that broken to begin with, and we don't have to use crazy workarounds to answer questions and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of the earlier discussion, is that if we treat our job as kind of, let me put it a different way. If the feedback that we're getting is as a first responder that's fixing problems, it kind of takes away our desire to maintain a strong implementation. And so I guess I'm kind of speaking to the business owners and the analysts and the users of data, that not that implementers and architects need constant coddling and pats on the back, but if we're only telling them they're doing a good job, when it's Jen,
Right.
that's that case where it's like, oh, we have to be really creative because this is fundamentally broken and we're going to do all this crazy stuff and get you where we want, we feel good because we got it done. I think we also need to feel good about that not having to happen. And I think that that's part of it, is we all like to be recognized for doing a good job. And again, this gap of the fact that if we do it right and build something that's very stable and maintainable, we often don't get that pat on the back because we're never put in that position to, quote, save the day, when
Right.
really we have a lot. you know. And I think we need to thank those people that are keeping everything running without it breaking down. That should be celebrated.
And sometimes it's just a matter of not even turning around and saying, hey, Jen, you did a really good job of setting this up and preventing headaches and everything's gone so smoothly. Like, yes, I like hearing that, sure. But even just saying, hey, Jen, here's the report that we presented and the insight we got out of the data you saw. You might be surprised how rarely the implementers and devs and all of that get to see stuff like that.
Yeah.
So merely including them in the value getting side of things and letting them see the end result um, can add a lot to that validation.
Agreed. And it can also help to make for a better implementation, because
Yes,
if you're
absolutely.
sharing how
Yep.
the data is being used, then as an implementer, I can think more strategically and more from a business
Yep.
perspective of how I'm collecting that data. It's a win-win all around.
And I meant to say something earlier about that too. Of odds are you will have people making development decisions that affect your data layer and therefore your analytics who are never going to be actively doing insight and analysis and all of that. So there is always going to be a bit of a split there where the folks who are implementing may not will always be in a separate role from the analysts. But if you can at least do a little bit of cross training, sometimes even just showing them, hey, here's what we say when we mean data layer, because I'll walk you through what I set up in launch, so you can see why it matters that you set this attribute the way that you do, or you can see that this attribute, I just need it to be intuitively named, and it doesn't matter if you follow the naming system I gave you or not. Like so many things like that, that just having a conversation, this is going to sound horrible, but assuming intelligence and interest in the developers, because frequently they're just, they're automatons. You give them a Jira ticket and they do it. But often you can bring them in and say, hey, here is how we are using this. Maybe you can use some of your intelligence to help us do it better in a way that makes sense, or more efficient at bare minimum.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, and I also think it's a good argument for whether you're working with an outside agency or an internal
Mm-hmm.
development team, to recognize that there is a huge value gap between handing someone a Jira ticket and saying go collect this data, and handing someone a request saying partner with us to figure out how to collect the right data that we're going to be able to
Mm-hmm.
action to do X. And I think oftentimes those two get lumped together into the same thing, and they're simply not. And
Right.
I think it's important that we recognize that.
Yep. Yep. And to be fair, I talked about showing them how it all connects together in launch, but also showing them how it looks in analytics and stuff. I think it's important not to train them on it, not to expect them to use it perhaps, but at least give them visibility into how their part of the process affects every other part of the process. It can make a big difference.
Yeah, it's getting that buy-in from those other teams that aren't going to use it regularly, but then they see the value. They see
Hmm.
the value of what you're asking for. They see the value of the work that goes into it. So when you put a request in to change something, add something, fix something, it's not just disregarded as, oh, it's data collection. Which,
Yep.
Jen, you and I talked a bit last week about this, where a lot of times in organizations collecting data for analytics and marketing, it's seen as secondary.
Right.
It's and I always give the caveat that yes, if you can't process a transaction in checkout, that is definitely more important. But beyond that, this is often seen as secondary. It's seen as extra. So if you can get that the buy-in, to use a cliche, from product, from
Hmm.
development, that this is important, and doing exactly what you laid out there, get you to that point where they they will prioritize your requests.
Hmm.
That's one of the things I found.
And it does go the other way too, of helping your analysts know what it is the developers do. And yes, they don't need to be trained on launch, perhaps. They don't need to be trained on JavaScript and your all of the stuff that goes into creating the data layer. But if they at least see what that part of the process looks like, then they can ask more intelligent questions and um, everything becomes a bit more efficient. I just keep going back to the example of, they say, oh, we need to track these 12 new pages, and here are the page names and page types that we want for each of them. And we take that very literally, and we take it to the devs, and they put in all those page names and page types. But it turns out that the proposed page names and page types are slightly different from what was already in the CMS. Like, they could have already used something that was built in, but they went in and did a lot of extra work to do the custom things because that's what was asked of them. And they're not used to going back to the analyst and saying, hey, would this that gets the same point across value that already exists and would save us a lot of effort and reduce points of failure, would that be okay with you? Because usually the analyst would say, yeah, it's an arbitrary page name or page type, whatever, if having it named home is more easy than having it be named landing or something like that. There's having that communication both ways, being open is really important, which actually is the last thing I really wanted to get at, is just for a good implementation, communication processes is like the biggest thing.
Yeah.
And that's communication within the analytics team and the folks building the data layer, like I just talked about, but also it's so key and important to have communication between the analytics folks and the product folks, and between analytics and obviously marketing, which is, I think, the more obvious one. And better yet, communication between analytics and leadership. Like, not just handing them off the dashboard because they want to check the box that says that they have analytics in place and they want to double check over our shoulders that things are going right, but to actually say, hey, you guys are making decisions about what's happening next quarter. We have data that might help you make those decisions. Can we maybe set up some sort of actual process, relationship, cadence, whatever, that makes it so the data can be more useful.
Yeah, no, it's such a strong point, and I agree. Analytics, the role of analytics implementer is kind of like a product manager. We have so many different people that we need to work together with and make sure that we're aligning all of these pieces, that communication and how we design those things is oftentimes way more complicated, and way more important than the JavaScript or the actual wiring data point from A to B. But it often gets overlooked, and I'm glad you brought up the executive leadership function. That's one I learned the hard way when I was client side, brand new. I wanted to get in right away and let's just collect data and do stuff, and was really happy and excited about doing it. And I remember the first time that I sat down with our leadership team to start talking about some of the new insights that we're going to be able to report on. Less than 5 minutes into the meeting, I think the CEO said something like, "But Jason, that's not how we look at this data." You made a lot of assumptions that just don't align with how we view the data for our business, and we have to go back and redo that now. And I'm like, I felt stupid. I felt, but it was a good lesson. It's like, okay, well, I don't know everything about how this business works and how they think about the data. And then when you get to be like a public company, there's certain ways they look at data because they, have quarterly earnings calls and they need consistency in how these numbers are reported. And so, there's a lot that can be learned and that we need to think about from well, how does the business actually look at this data? Because we probably have some ideas. The product manager probably has some ideas. I'm sure the dev team has some different ideas. But if we're talking about these numbers at a company level, and especially if we're exposing numbers externally to shareholders or others, it's important that we're doing it in such a way that aligns with how the company views the data that we're collecting and presenting to them.
Man, I'm so jaded because I hear that and I just think, I'd just be excited to get them using the data, much less find out how they are using the data. But I mean, it ultimately comes down to the same thing, though, of having that communication and making sure they know what they have available to them. And then you can know how they want to use it.
Yeah. One of the other points that you brought up that I think is such a good exercise is to sit down with your dev teams, especially if you can identify individuals. And I guarantee you every company has at least one, because doing this for 20 years, I haven't found a company yet that doesn't have a dev that is hyper interested in analytics.
Hmm.
And so, just spending a little bit of time saying, hey, I know where I'm throwing all these tickets over the wall to ask you to do X, Y, and Z. Do you have 30 minutes? We can sit down. I'd love to show you what we're collecting it, how we're collecting it. Not only that, I want to show you how the business is using it to report on, how people are using our mobile app or our website. And it creates such a huge value opportunity within the business to do that. Not only do you strengthen that relationship and now you have a really strong advocate in the development function, but oftentimes if you're open to it, they can be providing incredible feedback to you. And I, again, back on the client side, I had that happen where the devs would come to me and said, hey, I know you're asking for it like X, but kind of X plus one plus, like, if we just tweak it a little bit, it's going to be so much better for what I think is there, is being asked. Does that make sense? Or sometimes they'll come back and say, hey, you're not even asking for this, but I want to let you know we have visibility into these things. Would that be interesting to you? And so I just think there's a huge upside into investing in that relationship with your dev team to make sure that it's not just tossing stuff over and they have no clue why they're pushing A into slot B of the data layer. But just taking that little bit of time to say, here's why this data is meaningful and how the business is using it can be incredibly valuable.
Yep, agreed. Like if anyone could have any single takeaway from all of this, that would be my recommendation. It's just have those conversations with your devs and connect those dots, because not only can they proactively suggest better or different ways of doing things, but it can also help analytics not fall through the cracks and be forgotten and be left out of conversations.
That's right.
If they're working on a new site feature and they see that there's not any analytics on it, and they can reach out and say, hey, do you know about this thing? I've seen that happen multiple times where we wouldn't have known about it otherwise. So, because communication breakdowns.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. And I think companies that have figured it out have really hit a really good stride in that. I think we're no longer working with them, but Princess Cruise Lines, I think
Hmm.
with what they've been able to have in place, and Ryan is kind of that developer advocate that understands both sides of the fence has been. I mean, I think that's an
Oh yeah.
incredibly good model to follow where like it just worked. It works so beautifully well.
Hmm. Yep, I agree. Man, you get Jason and I together, and Jim, you've been so quiet.
Nah, no worries. I mean, this is good. This is what I was kind of hoping to drum up. And when I was putting this one together, I was curious where we would take it. Like, I started listing out some thoughts around. You get into the thoughts of like everybody's go-to is well polished requirements, which is a given. But I've really loved the conversation around maintenance and the maintenance mindset, because as we were talking about that, it brought back memories of over the years where it was always the rush to do something new. So you ended up with this situation where you had basically data hoarders, where it was always adding something new and not going back and checking and making sure that, hey, do we still need this old stuff? Is it valuable? Are we not paying attention to the stuff that we use and there's data decay? So that was great to listen to. And then also just the discussion around getting buy-in from development, talking with, finding advocates in development that will find value in what you're building. That is definitely something that is overlooked, because Jen, you mentioned it, that a lot of times development is just seen as automatons. I love the word that you use there, where it's like people just throw Jira tickets at them, they whatever system that they're using, and say, hey, here, just do this. And the why is lost, and it's either done or it's deprioritized or it's a fight to get done. So I mean, yeah, I mean that's incredibly valuable. So other than those two, and then also we did briefly talk about, you know getting the attention of executives. If you were to think back to a client you've worked with in the past and you're like, that was a top-notch implementation, what are some of the other characteristics that you think of when you think back to that?
The one thing that we haven't touched on that I think even some of the best implementations I don't think have excelled in this area but have been better than others is documentation. Is some kind of Wikipedia, some kind of knowledge base on what is in place. I would say for the vast majority, probably 90% plus of the companies I've worked with over the last, again, 20 years, very, very few of them put any thought into documentation. And so there's a lot of wasted time in redoing. There's a lot of wasted time in miscommunication. And I think as part of a good sustainable implementation, there has to be some sort of expectation for a baseline level set of documentation. I mean, at a bare minimum, some sort of change log.
Oh goodness, yes.
Right, because there's so many things that go wrong that just a simple change log could save so much anguish and hours of trying to figure out what happened, and just that simple thing is rarely done.
Well, and it's funny because just today, I came across a change that we're making for a client that should be improving things, but because things have been broken, they've been using workarounds, and those workarounds are going to break once things get fixed, if that makes sense. So trying to figure out what workarounds need to be updated to include the new and better solution. I go into this client, one of their main dashboards, and looking at the data that seems to be most important and in use, and I spot the thing that will be broken by the changes we're making, only because whoever was in there and created it put a beautiful description on the segment and the workaround that they had in place and why the workaround was the way that it was. And honestly, like, I don't know who did it. I thought maybe it was John, because I know that he worked on that dashboard too, but he didn't know either. And I just want to go and give that person a hug. They saved me so much time by just using that built-in functionality. You know, every segment you create, every component you use, every variable, you have the ability to add notes to it. You don't have to approach it as this huge Leviathan task of getting everything documented, though that is great. If you can get a complete solution design variable map and a Confluence page about your data layer and like all that stuff is great. But even just starting with, hey, this might be the only note that we have anywhere in launch, but you got to start somewhere. Adding notes and using descriptions and things like that on your analytics components can be a great place to get started. Save a lot of future headaches.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think most of these tools that we work with have that feature, have that functionality. And even if they don't, there's a lot that can be documented just within how we name things or set things up. But I think a lot of times we're in such a hurry, or we feel so overwhelmed that it's like we got to get to that next thing. And just taking literally 60 seconds to put some note in place is too much of a burden. And again, I think slowing down a little bit to do that, I think we need to, again, celebrate how much of these maintenance type activities, although they may be small in investment, end up being huge savings in the long run. But I think we don't. And that probably leads to part of why it isn't done. I think if whoever left that note, or if we were more consistent in giving praise and feedback when we see those type of things, I think most people would want to do it, because again, we all like to get recognized.
Yep.
Well, then, Jason, like to that point, I would also then say we need to stop celebrating tagging everything.
Yes.
Setting up data collection for everything. We need to stop celebrating that, because that is one of the things that creates the situation where people feel they need to rush and move on to the next thing, and they don't document anything. because it's, oh, we need to move on to the next one, or we got this next thing to tag, or it's not all done yet, so we need to keep moving.
Yeah, and I think that all or nothing mindset is a huge part of the problem too. Of like a lot of people know that they need better documentation. It just seems like too big of a task to possibly get started on, um, especially when you are rushed and everything. But I do think in most cases you got to start somewhere, and it's okay if only one item gets documented because you had a moment. Like just it's okay if it's incomplete. Just start. Do
Yeah,
something.
it's an important point because I've been thinking about documentation and note taking just in general. It's something I'm not great at and something I'm trying to do better. And I've got some private pages set up in Notion to try to do that for myself. And I think Jen, you brought up one of the huge mental stumbling blocks I have is that, well, I have to have this whole perfect system in place and do it perfectly all the time. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. And so when it's not, because it never is perfect and it's never set up perfectly to start, I give up. And it's like, well, I'm never going to get there. And so I think it's important that we recognize that we can start small. We can start with even a small framework. It's going to be in a Jim, I think, or Jim or Jen, you were mentioning this as I jump back on, that these things are always evolving. We're not going to have it perfect, and it should never be looked at as a static thing we do. It's going to evolve. And so start somewhere, start putting in just a random note, start to develop that habit. It has to start somewhere, and it doesn't need to be this overly complicated, exhaustive system to start. You just sometimes just have to start.
It's okay if your change log starts today and
Yeah.
doesn't include all of the historical anything, because
Yep.
it's got to start somewhere. And if you start it today, you'll be thanking yourself a few months down the line.
Absolutely.
The visual that comes to mind when you're talking about just start taking notes. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to spend all this time, being exhaustive up front. Just start. It reminds me of when I was in 8th grade and got my first CD player. And it's like, oh my God, I got the CD player. I need to go out and get all of these CDs. No, you don't. It's you're going to slowly collect it over time, and next thing you know, you have this massive music collection. And it's a parallel I draw with notes. Just get started somewhere, start adding them, and they
Yep.
will grow over time.
Yep.
It's funny because Jason just totally helped me realize why I keep using Apple Notes instead of everything else. It's because I feel like in Apple Notes, I can be messy and it's full of mistakes and half-written thoughts and all of that going back years and years and years. So like to me, that's kind of the rough draft spot for notes, and I end up using it constantly. And then those notes never move into Evernote, Notion,
Yeah.
whatever. So
Yeah.
Interesting.
Something to think about.
Yeah, I definitely have if you can't get it 100% right, don't do it at all complex, and that can definitely hold you back. It's funny, actually, when I was transitioning off of a client that I had been on 40 hours a week for a few years, like it was a big full-time client for me for a while, and I was handing it off to another Adobe consultant, and she actually printed out a thing that said, "Perfect is the enemy of good," because she'd noticed about myself that I frequently didn't finish things because it didn't seem good enough to keep doing. And yeah, I do. I should probably reprint that and have it put somewhere, because sometimes you just need to be good and not perfect.
Yeah, and I think it's something that afflicts many of us at 33 Sticks. We kind of all have that mentality, and one of the things I remind people when I talk to them is that your mediocre is better than most people's best in this space. We've collected a group of people that have an incredible amount of knowledge and experience, and we're very high perfectionists, and not as an excuse not to push ourselves to do better, but sometimes I think it's important to remember that even on our off days, we're operating at an incredibly high level.
2 weekends ago, I had this great conversation with my brother-in-law. We were up in Connecticut visiting, and we were, my father-in-law and I were doing a project with the jigsaw and the older kids. And he was telling this story of when he was living in California before he moved to Connecticut, and he came across this woodworker. And he's like, the guy was legally blind. he just happened to see him in the workshop. I was out walking the dog, so I went to talk to him because he was kind of getting into a couple projects. And the guy was like, and for those watching the video, we'll see the hand gestures. He motioned like the gentleman did as when he was talking to him. And he asked him like, what about this? What about this tool? What about that? He goes, oh, no. Here's what you need. And he starts gesturing and he feels things around. He goes, oh, here, you need this. You need this. You need this. He goes, well, won't I need this tool to get it just right? He's like, man, you're not making a clock. It does, it's not a clock. You're doing something with a cabinet. And when you think about it, what he means by it's not a clock is it doesn't have to be pinpoint precise. No one from like the Department of Weights and Measures is going to come in and make sure it is absolutely perfect. It could be flawed a bit. It, we're not talking like door hanging off a hinge, but it doesn't have to be extremely precise. And I keep trying to remind myself of that at times. Like, it doesn't have to be a clock. It doesn't have to be a clock. It's, sometimes good is just what's needed. Perfect will actually be the problem.
Yeah. And I like that analogy because it also means, let's say you're building a cabinet and you do make a mistake on one side of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that the other side of it is not going to be perfect. Or like with a clock, all pieces have to be perfect.
Yes.
Whereas everything else, you have a little bit of room to not be held down by your mistakes. Like, yeah, that mistake will just affect that one piece. And the rest we can continue on.
Like a great analogy, Jen, going back to something you mentioned earlier, is about page names and working with the developer. Like there may already be page names. They may not be exactly what, say, someone laid out, but they can be perfect, or they could work well enough that development doesn't have to go in and completely rebuild something for certain specific page names. Just an idea. It's like, it's good enough. It's not a clock.
Yep.
Dig it.
Totally.
Getting oh no.
Not good.
I was just gonna say, because getting a page represented in a report with an identifier that works is more important than getting the page name that you wanted, but down the line. Yeah, that just driving that point home, I suppose.
Yeah.
That,
I think it's the perfect example. Because like if you're not talking to your developers, to go back and rehash that topic for a minute, if you're not talking with them and you're just sending in blind requests, they may feel that they have to completely re-implement something or rebuild something to surface that data, where data that works just as well is already available and can speed things up.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, this has been fun. It's been great to get the three of us together again. It's been a while. We're going to continue this topic next week. We're going to continue some of this. So not necessarily around implementation specifically, but this just general theme. So any parting words before we wrap up?
No, I mean, this has been a fun conversation, and I think we hit on some big things. And in your recap, I think there's 2 or 3 things there that companies and people can get started on right away that aren't going to take a huge investment.
That's what I was going to say, is just, if you take anything away, just there are small things that you can start doing now that will pay off in the long run. You just got to start somewhere.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you both, and we'll go ahead and wrap up for now.
See you.
Catch you later.